Hey, folks. So today we're going to be talking about some of the trends that were happening in the 18th and 19th century that would eventually lead to a science of psychology. And in particular, we're going to be focusing on the empiricists and the positivists. So you might remember from our discussion last week about the ways of knowing that empiricism is learning and understanding your environment through direct personal experience. Now, remember, almost all of us use almost all of the ways of knowing at some point or another, depending on the situation and what we know about it and our mood at the time and how distracted we are. But the empiricists say that empiricism, direct sensory experience, is the most important way of knowing, right? Compare that to the rationalists, who we'll talk about next time, who thought that it was all about the mind and all about the mental world. You might remember from our talk about the ancient world and the ancient thinkers that Plato was more of a rationalist, right? Thinking that you can just kind of think real hard about the issue and come to the correct solution. Whereas his student Aristotle was more of an empiricist. So what we see in the late 1700s to early 1800s in Britain is a renewed interest in empiricism over rationalism. So, one of the most influential empiricists, John Locke. John Locke's thinking about the human mind and human rights and freedom ended up being influential on the founding fathers of the United States. So, when the founding fathers would say things like, it is self evident that all men are created equal, they're borrowing heavily from the ideas of John Locke. So, why did John Locke believe that all men are created equal? Well, one thing is that he believed that all knowledge, all behavior was learned behavior. He thought of the human mind as this kind of blank slate. Yeah, we might have a few reflexes that we're born with, like the reflex to breathe or the reflex to keep ourselves from falling. But for the most part, almost all of our behaviors and thoughts and attitudes, according to John Locke anyway, come from learning and experience. So to John Locke, the mind is like a chalkboard that you hadn't written anything on yet, right? So, I mean, yeah, there's something pre existing there, the chalkboard, but until somebody writes on it, right? Until the chalkboard experiences something, it's just a blank chalkboard. That's what John Locke thought of it, and that's what John Locke's theories of equality were based on. So, because Locke didn't think any knowledge was innate, he said, since everything that we learn through experience. That makes John Locke one of the leading figures in this resurgence of empiricism in the British world around about this time. So, knowing the world through direct interaction and experience. So, Hobbes was very big on personal freedom, on life, liberty, and I believe his third one was property. Notice that in America, it ended up being life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness because not all the founding fathers thought that people were entitled to property. So Hobbes is a little bit crankier than Locke, and you can kind of see it in his face here, right? So Hobbes believed that humans were matter in motion. Think about that. We've seen that idea a few times before. If we think about Spinoza, we see a very similar idea. And well, what does that mean? In this case, it means human behavior is the same thing as natural behavior. That the same way that you could, in theory, predict a rainstorm or good weather or bad weather, you should be able to predict human behavior because it's all the process of some kind of natural influence. Think about what we talked about last time with the dualists and the monists. Thomas Hobbes falls more on the monist side of things, right? He thinks that there's not really this world of mentality versus a world of physicality, that everything that's going on, including our mental states, are the product of natural processes. However, Hobbes believed that humans were primarily hedonistic, right? Whereas Locke said humans are going to be whatever you teach them to be. That's what Locke thought. Hobbes thought, well, what humans are going to be unless you deliberately go in and change it is they're just going to be selfish and stupid and petty. And without good laws and good government, life is nasty, brutish, and short. It would be perpetual warfare without good government. It would be just complete chaos because people are dumb and selfish, and they would only cater to their own dumb and selfish needs. So many people thought of Hobbes at the time as an atheist, But not unlike some of the people we've talked about before, Hobbes is actually more of a deist. So he believed that there was such a thing as a God, and he believed that the universe was created by this God. But remember, deism believes that once the creator kind of set the world in motion, it steps back and lets it do its own thing. So the deist God doesn't intervene to prevent atrocities or intervene to create miracles or something like that. It's sort of like he sets the opening parameters of the universe and then lets it do what it will after that. Many of the founding fathers, by the way, were themselves deists. So when they talk about providence and creation, yeah, they're talking about a creator in the sense of a God, but it might be a little bit different idea of God compared to what many of the Christians at the time would have believed it. So another important character here, David Hume. So David Hume is known for his extreme skepticism. Now, compare this to somebody like Francis Bacon, who lived near the end of the Renaissance. We talked about him last time, or a couple of times ago. Francis Bacon founded the theory of induction. It says if you want to know how the world works, take a little slice of it, examine it, and then extrapolate from there, right? So I run an experiment on this thing in my lab, and based on what I observed, I can generalize to all other things in that lab or in that species, right? Including human behavior. If I study humans in a lab, then I should be able to make generalizations about humans in the real world. Hume, however, was quite critical of that approach. He says, well, you can use the method of induction 5, 10, 15, 20, 1,000 times, and you never know if you've got the correct answer or if you just have a whole bunch of different approximations of the correct answer. Hume said you could let go of a rock and it would drop to the ground 5,000 times, but you have nothing that guarantees that on the 5,001st time, the rock just won't float up into the sky somewhere. So Hume believed the only way that we could get anywhere close to the truth was by just trying to observe and observe and observe and observe. And the more observations we make, well, the closer to the truth we're going to get, but we're never going to be 100% sure about the truth. This is especially true when you think about the human mind and all the biases that the mind has. You know, how we like to see things that we want to see rather than seeing things as they are, or whether we make incorrect conclusions about cause and effect, which humans do all the time, right? So maybe Hume has good reason to suggest that we be skeptical, and we try to take a very skeptical approach to claims that are made, right? Never being entirely sold of them, always looking for some kind of evidence that would help either disconfirm or provide a little bit more evidence. So John Stuart Mill comes toward the end of the heyday of the empiricists. His father, James Mill, was also a very influential thinker. James Mill gives us the idea of the clockwork mind. Remember, we talked about thinkers tend to use analogies for the human mind based on whatever complicated technology is around them, right? Whether it's a pair of horses on a chariot that you got to keep in line for Socrates, or a clock with a bunch of gears and moving parts, like James Mill thought, or, as we'll see later on with the cognitive revolution, people comparing the mind to a computer, right? Just whatever a complicated piece of technology happens to be around, oh, the mind's like that. Now, John Stuart Mill pioneered this idea of mental chemistry. See, we were learning lots of stuff about chemistry and chemical reactions and the nature of elements and microscopic particles, not particles at the time, but they were able to see things that are smaller than the naked eye. And that led John Stuart Mill to think, well, if we see a lot of the stuff in the physical world is actually a chemical reaction, well, maybe what's going on in the mind is a chemical reaction too. He called that mental chemistry. And at first, that might sound a little bit like Galen and Hippocrates, right? Where you got the four humors that might be out of balance. But when we think about neurotransmitters, right? People who are depressed may have too little dopamine in their brains. People who are anxious may have too little GABA in their brains, and so on and so on. So isn't that a form of mental chemistry too? So although John Stuart Mill might not have been able to observe neurotransmitters with the technology he had at the time, he stumbled upon an idea that had some weight later on that would be confirmed by later experimentation and later observations. John Stuart Mill is also famous for popularizing this phrase, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So this means that you have a piece of complicated machinery and it's actually doing more than you would expect based on the individual parts alone. Let's go back to the horse analogy with Plato and Socrates. Two horses can pull more weight than you would expect from either horse alone, right? Let's say one horse, and I'm just making these numbers up. Let's say one horse can pull 500 pounds and another horse can pull 500 pounds. You put them together, you might say, oh, they're going to be able to move 1,000 pounds. But the horses, if they know each other, are able to work as a team and actually pull a load that's far greater than that, right? Let's again pull it, making up a number. Let's say they can pull 1,500 pounds instead of 1,000. Again, I'm making those numbers up, but that is a real thing that happens with horses. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So why do we have this idea that our mind is so complex if it's just a bunch of natural things happening? Well, because there's a whole lot of parts in our mind, and the whole is going to be greater than the sum of its parts. John Stuart Mill was also pretty ahead of his time when it came to things like women's rights and racial equality. Not unlike Locke, John Stuart Mill believed that the main behavioral differences between men and women, the main behavioral differences between white people and black people, were the product of learned experiences rather than things that were innate and purely biological. Now, this is a pretty radical idea for the time, especially because even most of the people in America who believed in abolition, even most of the people in America who wanted to end slavery, still did not quite believe in racial equality the way that we think of it. Many of the abolitionists at the time believed that Black people should have the same kind of legal protection, equal legal protections, or religious abolitionists might have believed that, regardless of whether you're Black or white, you are equal before God. But most of them, like most people in America, like most white people at the time, just sort of not innately is the wrong word, but just sort of took it as a matter of faith that white people were superior to black people in terms of, say, intellect or civilization. But John Stuart Mill, on the other hand, believed that, like, no, it's all just equal, right? So if there is a behavioral difference between people you see who were born in slavery and people you see who were born free, well, maybe the experiences of being a slave or being a free person are what shaped that rather than something like the color of their skin. So all of this empirical philosophy gave rise to something called positivism. Now, positive is used here in the same sense as certain, right? Like when you say I'm positive, to say I'm certain about something. So positivism is the belief that we can come to certain knowledge about the universe, right? We don't have to just speculate and hum and twiddle our fingers, right? Hume believed we could never get to the real answers, we could just get to closer approximations of the truth. Positivism, in contrast, says, well, there's a way to get to certain truth. There's a certain truth out there, and if we observe it very carefully, and if we use a little bit of logic here and there to string the things together, then we can come up with a real understanding of the universe. And Auguste Comte was the most influential figure when it comes to positivism. So he says three stages of, what we might call epistemology. Epistemology is just a fancy word for why we believe things or how we believe things. So theological, phenomenon are dictated and explained by the dictates of some deity. Why is it raining? Well, the god of rain is either happy with us if we needed rain or mad at us if it's raining to the point that it's torrentially flooding. Comte said the next stage was metaphysical, where the divine concepts are replaced with impersonal abstractions. Well, why is it raining? Well, somewhere out there, there's the idea, there's the perfect rain, and we just happen to be experiencing some manifestation of the ideal perfect rain. Plato loved this idea. Aristotle loved this idea as well, right? Very metaphysical explanations that what we're experiencing is just some kind of reflection of the metaphysical world, even though that metaphysical world might not be driven by a thinking deity. Positivism, Comte claims, that phenomena are explained by the laws of natural cause and effect. Why is it raining? Well, there is a certain amount of moisture trapped in the air, and when that moisture becomes too much for the air to hold, then it starts coming down back to the ground in the form of precipitation. So there you don't necessarily need to explain it through a god, or you don't need to explain it through some kind of abstract representation of rain. Instead, you just explain it based on the natural processes in the natural world. Well, this naturally drew some criticisms from different groups. For example, some people claimed that Comte was just trying to replace religion with science, with Comte as the head of the Church of Science, right? So this brings up an interesting question, right? When we listen to scientists, how much are we just appealing to authority, right? We talked about authority being one of the ways of knowing. Well, if a scientist says something is true, why should we believe it, right? Why should we just take their word for it? We'll get into that later on in the semester when we talk about modern trends in psychology and what's happening when people publish modern day psychological research papers. And then there were people at the time who felt that positivism discounted feelings and emotions. So if you're saying that observation with just a little bit of logic mixed in there is all you need to understand the world, well, what about my feelings? What about my intuitions? What about the way that my emotions tell me the world works? Well, we'll come to that next time when we start talking about the Romanticists and how this movement called Romanticism is sort of a reply to positivism and a lot of the logical, philosophical trends that were going on at the time. All right, see you then.